I want to ask the Taoiseach Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade if you believe that the EU and the international community are doing enough to end the conflict in Syria, which was just marked its 7th anniversary. Almost 500,000 people have been killed since 2011, and over 13 million people now require humanitarian assistance, including close to 3 million trapped in besieged and hard-to-reach areas. So I'm just wondering, if the Minister could respond on the basis of, are there any proposals for a change to the EU response, please? Thank you.
Very much, Deputy Minister. 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The UN Special Envoy for Syria, Stefan de Mistura, is leading political negotiations to end the conflict based on the 2012 Geneva Communique and the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Ireland and the EU fully support this process. The EU provides direct assistance to the UN-led Geneva peace talks and has launched, in coordination with the UN, an initiative to develop political dialogue with key actors from the region to identify common ground. Ireland strongly welcomed the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 2401 on the 24th of February. This resolution calls for an immediate ceasefire and unhindered humanitarian access. The international community must redouble efforts to press for the immediate and full implementation of the ceasefire and unimpeded humanitarian access to populations that are in need. EU foreign ministers discussed the situation in Syria at their formal meeting on the 15th of February and again at the Foreign Affairs Council meeting on the 26th of February and again on the 19th of March. The EU and its member states have to date mobilised almost €10.5 billion for humanitarian assistance inside Syria and in neighbouring countries, making the EU the largest donor to this effort. The EU hosted a donor conference for Syria in April 2017, at which pledges totalling €5.6 billion were made, and will host another donor conference on Syria next month. Since 2012, Ireland has contributed over €95 million to the humanitarian effort in response to the conflict in Syria. Ireland will make a further pledge of humanitarian support in 2018 at the Brussels Donor Conference next month. Ireland also provides political and financial support to a broad range of measures to ensure full legal accountability for all war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Syria. But the direct answer to your question is we can never do enough until this conflict is over. And I think in the years ahead, history will judge the international community very harshly in terms of how this conflict has developed over a long period of time and the number of civilians that have lost their lives as a result of it.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that we can never do enough in this regard. The problem is that the conflict has moved into now its 7th year, and if you look at the actions and the indiscriminate attacks and bombing of eastern Ghouta, it's actually a carbon copy nearly of what happened in Aleppo, and the international community effectively stood by. Not in the sense of standing by and not caring about it, but I think that we honestly have to look at the UN Security Council, how the veto works, Russia's role within that of being on the Security Council whilst also being a major player within, in the area, and a major supporter of the Assad regime. And I think what's more worrying is that the war is effectively now a global war being fought out in Syria with all different global partners. So it's more and more complex, and I suppose the longer it goes on, the less I see any opportunity of this conflict ending in the short term. And I'm wondering, from your discussions with colleagues in the region, because I know you visited the region, what is the view there? Is there any chink of light? Is there any hope at all that stalled talks? I know it's difficult to include Assad in those talks, but including members of the regime to try to bring about a ceasefire, or really are we just waiting for Assad to effectively win the war and wipe out the opposition?
Thank you. 1 minute reply, Thomas.
Well, I was actually at the UN Security Council when it met a number of weeks ago, and the first item on the agenda raised by the Secretary-General, Gutierrez, was Eastern Ghouta. And he made a personal appeal to all of the states represented around that table to implement an immediate ceasefire. He described what was happening there as hell on earth. And I think many of us who have looked at video coverage and television footage of what was happening at that time in Eastern Ghouta, particularly those of us who were parents, found it pretty hard to watch. I think there is a huge effort to try to make this ceasefire work and stick. Having said that, though, I do think that the Assad regime feel that they are victorious and need to finish the job militarily. And of course, that is resulting in ongoing conflict and military activity that is impacting in a pretty dire way on many civilians and women and children.
Thank you.
So we will continue to push hard through the Foreign Affairs Council and UN structures to ensure that the EU voice is very strong and clear on this, which it is. But I think we have some time to go yet.
And you will have a final minute for you, Deputy O'Brien.
And I'm fully aware of the constraints that Ireland operate under and the influence that we would have, the small level of influence there, but it's important it's kept at the top of the agenda. I do wonder, in the context of us seeking a seat at the UN Security Council in 2020, and given the failure of the UN Security Council to halt the Assad regime and their allies, such as Putin's Russia, will you be seeking changes to the operation of the Security Council, or have you thought about that or proposing them, particularly around the use of the veto, particularly if the veto is used by one of the combatants in any combat? I think we need to look at that into the future. So have you any thoughts on that? And you might give you an opportunity as well to maybe update the House briefly on how that campaign for us securing a seat in 2020 is going.
Thank you very much.